Well, hi, welcome back to our deep dive into Project Management Body of Knowledge, the 5th edition. Today is Module 14. We're going to start talking about risk and risk management, in particular planning for and identifying project risks. So what is risk management, project risk management, that is all about? It's about maximizing the likelihood and the impact of positive events called opportunities, and as well, it's minimizing the likelihood and impact of negative events, which are called threats. So this is risk management. We're going to deal with positive threats, opportunities, and we're actually going to try to make those positive events occur to our benefit of our project. And with the negative risks or threats, we're going to try to mitigate those, minimize them, or avoid them altogether. But the key here is we need to identify what these are first so that we have a plan for them. Project risk. Risk in general, positive or negative, is an uncertain event, and it impacts primarily our triple constraint, which is scope, time, and cost. Also, quality certainly could be impacted by a risk event, so a triple constraint and quality. Now we have things called known risks because we have identified them as a possible risk. And what we would do in project management is we would provide a contingency reserve, a monetary contingency reserve. If we're not able to manage that risk effectively, and if it occurs, we apply that money to it so that we can recover from it. These are known in the PMBOK lexicon as known unknowns. We know about the risk. We think they may occur, but we don't know if they will. The flip side of this are our unknown risks. These are risks that we did not identify for one reason or another, and so we still need to compensate for them in our plan if they would occur. So what we do is we apply a management reserve, which in itself is not part of the project budget, but it is an allocated fund on the side that we can draw from if we need to recover from a risk that we never anticipated would happen. So those are called unknown unknowns. We don't know about the risk because we haven't identified it, and we don't know if it'll occur if it did. So these are key words you need to understand when we're talking about project risk. Your contingency reserve for your known unknowns and your management reserve for your unknown unknowns. Project attitudes have a lot to do with risk. 3 terms in the PMBOK lexicon you need to understand: risk appetite, risk tolerance, and the risk threshold. What are these? Well, the risk appetite, and we're talking about in general, this could be your organization, but in more particular to our concern is our stakeholders' attitude toward risk, because that has a big bearing on how we're going to properly and effectively execute our project. So the risk appetite of, let's say, a stakeholder is the degree of uncertainty that they're willing to take in anticipation of getting a reward. I'm going to take this risk, and if I'm successful, I'll have this big reward. This project will be done, and I'll achieve something. But I take risk to do it. That's my appetite. I'll take a risk, provided I get something in the end for it. Now, the risk tolerance, a little different. It's the degree of risk that an entity, or of course a person, a stakeholder is an entity himself. So risk tolerance is the degree of risk that a person or an entity can withstand. My appetite, is kind of risk. Okay, I'll take some risks, but there's a point where I just won't tolerate it anymore. And when that point is reached, that's called the risk threshold. This is the point where an entity will, let's say, I'm just going to accept it as it is, or I'm no longer going to tolerate that risk. So these are the 3 things we need to understand: risk appetite, risk tolerance, and risk threshold. There they are. So let's put these in the context of our project management body of knowledge process groups, particularly the risk management process group and its processes. So what we're going to do, and these are the processes in the risk management. First, we're going to plan how we're going to manage risk in general, the how-tos, the guidelines, how we're going to do all this other stuff. We're going to identify risks as best we can on our project, and this is just not at the beginning. It's most important at the beginning because you get the bulk of your risks at the beginning of the project, but ongoing throughout the project. These risks will come, they'll go, you'll think of more, some will just not be viable anymore, so it's progressive elaboration all the time with risk. So we identify the risks. And then we need to know, well, just if these risks would occur, positive or negative risks, how would they affect our project? What impact would they have on our project? And we do certain technical techniques to these things. One of them is a qualitative risk analysis, where we try and identify the probability of this risk occurring, and if it occurs, what would be the impact on our project? Qualitative. Another one is the quantitative risk analysis, where we try to put actual dollar value on the impact of a risk. And we'll see this as we get into the detail here. Now, not all risks need a response plan. Some of them will just say if they happen, they happen. But some of them require an actual response. If they do happen, then you'll have a response plan. If this happens, here's what we're going to do. So you know in advance what you're going to do so that you're not running around like crazy saying, oh my God, look what happened here. What are we going to do? Well, you should have a plan for the most egregious risks. Or if it's an opportunity risk, you want a plan to actually make that risk occur so you can take advantage of it. And we'll see what those kind of things are. And finally, the whole thing, this whole bit, you need to control everything, all your risks, and we'll get into that. So here's our knowledge area grid, process group grid again. And again, I sliced off the risk management knowledge area down there. And here are our activities which are part of risk management knowledge area. The first 5 are bolded because they go in one of these process groups. So what do you think? Is it an initiating process? Do we plan and identify and initiating? No, you don't do that. Do we plan? And yeah, we plan. Okay, so all 4 of these or 5 of these are planning processes. We need to plan, make our plan. We plan for risk by identifying our risk, by doing our qualitative and our quantitative analysis, and then we plan risk responses. Now, one is left, control risks, and probably you're astute enough to figure out that is a monitoring and controlling process. So we're going to go through all of these as we go through this and the next module. So here's the first one, plan risk management. Here's our data flow diagram. So again, our risk is right up here in the middle in the gray box. Excuse me, there you go. What do we have at hand to help us identify our risks? Well, one of them is the project charter, because it may, in the charter, one of the components of a good charter is to identify major risks right at the onset, the things you just may know. So there may be information in the project charter or other information that is not necessarily risk-based, but we may see a major milestone in the charter that's, we kind of figure, boy, that's pretty aggressive. We may not be able to make that, so that's a risk. Okay, but now, we're further along perhaps in our project a little bit where we've actually, over here, started creating our project management plan and all subsidiary components of scope and cost and time and quality and procurement and all of them. And all of those will have some risk component to them. So that's why the project management plan comes in as an input, because it provides insights into possible risks at this point in time, whatever that might be. The stakeholder register is a very, very significant input to risk, because you're talking about people here, you're talking about your stakeholders, and each one of them has what? They have their views about risk. They have a risk appetite. Some stakeholders may be willing to take great risks to achieve an outcome. Some stakeholders may be very risk adverse. They say, oh, boy, we got to tread really lightly here. Don't take any risks. Don't make sure nothing happens. And you need to manage these competing risk appetites. And of course, they'll all have different risk tolerances. They'll only go so far before they hit the risk threshold, which is, all right, that's enough. Stop right there. Let's figure this out because this isn't working. So you need to deal with all these kind of issues when you're talking risk. And by the way earlier in our talk here about the processes of project management, I mentioned that certain of the knowledge areas are many, many times not even considered by project management, and risk is one of them. Either they don't understand it, they don't want to go through the effort, they don't think it's necessary, but boy, once they start having problems on a project and the stakeholder comes and says, why didn't you figure out this might happen? Well, that would have been a risk that probably you could have been identified way early in the game, and you would have been tracking your risk register, you'd be following it, say, well, things are happening and this risk just might occur, and then you have a plan to avoid it, or you may, if you don't have a plan, you may have to issue some change requests for corrective or preventative action rather. So risk is really important on a project. Don't overlook it. So stakeholder comes in, certain environmental and organizational process assets come in, like risk templates and guidance and stuff like that would be good to have. So they're up here in risk management. We're going to do our risk management plan right here. Let's look at this again though. When the plan is done, and again, it's really not ever done, progressive elaboration would keep it fresh and alive and up to date over time in your project. The plan is used by 11.2, the next process, where we actually go out and we list all the risks that we can ever think of. And that is where the risk register is an output of. You've heard me speak of the risk register. Here's where it's born, right here. It also goes into your quantitative, qualitative, and planned risk response as your guiding document to help you do those things. So this is the data flow. That's what risks are, positive, negative. So what we're going to do now when we come back is talk about the inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs for creating the risk management plan. Okay, now that we understand the environment about risk management, basically, let's talk about actually creating a plan to manage risk. So here we are in 11.1 process, and here's our input, tool, technique, output diagram, our ETO diagram, as it were, and a risk management plan, how to conduct our risk activities, and it's the project management plan, the charter, stakeholder registers are our primary inputs also to help us do that. What part of the plan helps us? Well, if we're to that stage of the game where we've actually started creating our scope and our schedule and our cost baselines, those are prime fodder for risk. Scope, we need to build this, need all these parts, maybe a specialized part, well, that's a risk, and really get it in time, that kind of thing. The schedule, cost, is this going to, cost may escalate because of labor problems to produce something, that's a risk. It's all these risks come out. Project charter, as I mentioned earlier, shows high-level risk, or it should, and that's a consideration, of course. And your stakeholder register is where you get really to the core of these three attributes, the stakeholders' risk, appetite, tolerance, and threshold. They're all key inputs to help you develop your risk register. Environmental factors, of course, are things that we learn about, but we don't have control over. And if you don't have control over something, there's an element of a risk there, right? You can't control it, but you need them. You're going to have it when you need it. You're going to get your human resources. Remember, human resources are an environmental factor. Okay, so are we going to get these people when we need them? Are we going to get the right people? Are they going to have the right attitude on the project? That's all risk. You may, some people are riskier than others. You may want to track certain persons on your staff, for example, more than others because they're riskier to you, and you want to manage that risk. So risk attitudes, thresholds, and tolerances out there with those people too. As far as inputs with your organizational assets, you may have already preset categories of risk where you may come up with 5 risks. Okay, well, let me tell you, that's way not enough. You may have hundreds of risks identified in your risk register, literally, and you need to manage all those things. So you need to then slice them and dice them and categorize them. Perhaps you can manage a group of risks as one thing because they may have the same root cause, okay, that you don't know yet, but you can categorize them. So the point here is your organization process assets may have risk categories already predefined that you can use, so you don't have to rack your brain to create them, recreate them yourself. So you use those assets if they're available. And they may have risk templates for you to use. For example, the risk register, they may have one to use. And again, let me say it again, I'm sure I said this earlier, the PMBOK does not prescribe any kind of templates. They give you examples of things, but they don't recommend you use those. So it's up to you primarily to get them from your organization if they exist. If not, you need to make up your own, and the best way to do that is search the web. If you're a member of a PMI, go there, find stuff there. They have risk management workbooks you can use. There are a wealth of resources so that you can get the templates for any knowledge area that you may need. Just research them if your organization does not have them. Now once you have these inputs, again, the objective here is to create a risk management plan. Here's our tools and techniques that are recommended to use. Analytical techniques. These are things to understand and define your risks. And in risk management context, again, your risk, stakeholder risk attitudes, you've got to understand what those are. And, you can ask the stakeholder, are you risk adverse? Or how much risk are you willing to take to have this project be successful? What's your attitude on this? And how far will you go before you say, we got to, not do that? So you're trying to understand the mental set of your stakeholders so that you can manage them properly and manage what they expect of you with risk management. Basically, what is their strategic project risk exposure? So, stakeholder risk profile analysis. This is a technique, obviously under analytical techniques that you could use. You could hold a meeting to basically grade and qualify a stakeholder's risk acceptance, appetite, tolerance. It's called officially in the PMBOK a stakeholder risk profile analysis. That is a function you could do to sit down and try to sort out all the risk attitudes and profiles of your stakeholders. Of course, as you're doing it, creating your plan now, call on expert judgment. Always do that if you can. Find somebody that has experience, either in your company or in your associations. Just generally on the web, find somebody that knows, that has done this before, that can help guide you, save you time, and end up with a better risk product. So expert judgment, help you with high-level risk planning, risk contingency reserve planning. Again, this is the contingency reserves. That's money and time put aside in case a risk does materialize. You have that money and time available to compensate for the problems that risk did cause that you'd expected might happen. And if it does happen, you're covered. It's not like, it's not like the management reserve, which you'd still have money set aside for things that you didn't even think about. Now, the deal with management reserves, though, as we'll see a little later, you got to watch out for that because that's not in your project budget. And if your organization, some other project needs some money badly, they're going to steal it from the management reserve. It's more difficult to keep hold of than a contingency reserve, which is actually officially part of your project budget. So it's a difference. So the lesson there is try not to have unknown unknowns. Try to identify everything that you can think of so that you can have a proper budget for it. And you can hold meetings as you try to create your risk management plan. You jointly develop it with you and the stakeholders. I mean, they are the ones who really want to reduce risk on their project. Or again, if it's an opportunity risk, they're going to want to make that materialize. An example of that might be a positive risk. You have some special equipment being built somewhere in a plant that you're purchasing for your project, and it's a 5-month lead time, which is okay with your project at that point, but you'd rather it be shorter because that will give you more efficiencies and so on. And it just so happens that that plant said, we're building this new assembly line right next to it, and part of your negotiation with that contract with them was that if you get this done according to their schedule, which is in 3 months, okay, you will move our stuff and give it priority on the new assembly line, and we'll have it in 3.5 months instead of 5, for example. That is an opportunity risk that you want to happen. Now the risk is that they won't get the assembly line done, and you won't be able to take advantage of it. But that is a positive risk. You want that to happen. Versus a negative risk, and this is a real risk, that they'll have a union strike or have a problem with their building, and it'll be even later than the 6 months or 5 months. That's a negative risk that you don't want that to happen. So you may have a risk response plan there to have another supplier online to help backfill if that were to happen. So both positive, negative. So anyhow, you have meetings to do your high-level risk planning, develop the cost elements and the schedule activities that you may need to compensate for risk, which goes in your contingency budget. Risk reserve contingency approach, how you will apply those funds if you need them. Risk management responsibilities, somebody on your staff needs to be pretty much dedicated to following risk, keeping it fresh. It's not just a little side piece of paper you have. It's a live thing. You got to keep track of it all the time. You have levels of risk, high, low to very high probabilities of risk. And we're going to have this thing called a probability and impact matrix where we are able to categorize and determine the level of impact of various kinds of risk, and then assign probabilities to them and so on. We'll see that in detail. But anyway, when we're done, we come up with a plan. This is again the guidance, the how-to. We're going to manage the risk on our project. So there's a risk management methodology. Again, people have roles and responsibilities in the risk environment here. Budgeting, of course, like we said, your management and contingency reserves are in there. Timing of risk management tasks, meaning how often do you go through your risk register and follow up on those kind of things. And then you have your risk categories. I mentioned that your organization may have these predefined for you, but you need to group them with some logical, intelligent grouping. And you then can create a risk breakdown structure, which looks like, which would be part of our outputs, part of the risk management plan. We're going to talk a little bit more about the outputs here, though, when we come back. Okay, so here, I showed you last clip this risk breakdown structure. It looks an awful lot like an organizational chart. It looks an awful lot like what we're going to see later on as a work breakdown structure. In fact, it could very well be a work breakdown structure which we would use to our advantage to identify risks in the work breakdown task structure. In fact, if we look at this, let's just say, here's technical, requirements, technology, performance, quality. All these things have risk components to them, so this is a helpful kind of diagram to help us pinpoint and get us thinking about risks within the context of whatever this might be. Again, there's a lot of ways of doing this, but risk breakdown structure is a nice visual way to help you focus on a particular subject matter, to say, resources. What's the problem with resources? What risks are there with our resources, et cetera, et cetera? What risks are there with funding? Here, the 3.3. Funding is, the organization, even though they authorize the project, may become disenchanted with it because now they're off on some other strategy. Organizational strategies may change. They may want to cancel your project because they no longer think it's a viable value to them. That, if you see that coming, or you think that may happen, that is a risk. You got to manage it. You got to make sure that you know what's going on. You may have no control over it, but it is a risk. So, by the way, RBS could be used under other kinds. It could be a role breakdown structure. If you're doing security, it could be a rules breakdown structure. So RBS, if they use that in the PMP exam as just strictly RBS, you have to look at the question in its context to determine whether, and the possible answers, to determine and be sure that they're talking about a risk breakdown structure. Another one is a resource breakdown structure in PMBOK, where you have people, like an org chart, so you got to know which one they're talking about. So we output our plan. Further on that, we were down here, risk, probability, impact definitions, and a matrix, and here's what that would look like. This is your probability and impact matrix for risk. Your project objective over here, and objectives are, your cost, time, scope, and quality are the major objectives you're trying to manage throughout the project. And you can, up here, you would either get these predefined from your company already that you can use, or you need to make up your own. Well, what you're going to do is you're going to have a range from a very low to a very high, and then put a probability with it, like 0.5 or 5%, 10%, 20, 40, 80%, 80. And within the grid down here, you put, well, what is the impact at this level of possibility or probability? So if it's very low, 5% cost, and the risk happens, you say, well, it's an insignificant cost increase. It happened, okay. But if it's very high, you may expect more than a 40% cost increase in that item that is at risk, that is impacted by that threat should it materialize. Likewise with time, scope, and quality. Like here, quality. If you have an impact, some threat hits your quality processes, and it's only very low, but it hits 5%. So, well, there's a quality degradation, a little bit, barely noticeable. We can live with that. It's probably within tolerance of your metrics that are required by the project. Okay, but boy, if it's a very high and it hits you, you say, boy, it hit quality so bad, this product now is useless. So it can range from all these things. You need to set up something like this. And again, PMBOK does not prescribe any templates. They show this. You could use this kind of thing, and it is a pretty good one, so you may want to adopt it, unless, again, your organization has something that you can already use. Yeah, here's just one other example with scope. A high. If a high probability threat occurs, which you might expect, 40% of the time, with scope reduction is just unacceptable. That's unacceptable. That's what happens. And we'll see how to deal with these things as we go along here. So here's our probability and impact matrix we just talked about. Now down here we have stakeholder risk tolerance review. You want to keep fresh with your stakeholders because their attitudes may change. Okay. One way might be that they may be very risk adverse at the beginning of your project, but they see you managing the project very well. They see that you have your control over their risk register. They say they know what they're doing. They're trying to protect my project. Their risk tolerance, now may go up. Say, okay, I'll tolerate more. I'm not going to be on your back as much because I know that you have a plan to compensate if some of these things happen. And in fact, you've identified a lot of things that could happen. My gosh, I didn't realize all these things are risks, but you got it under control. So now you got your stakeholder in a better place. And of course, a plan for tracking all those activities, however you want to do it. So now that we have a plan, and we have this probability matrix as a guide to us, we're actually now in 11.2, we're going to start identifying all the risks we can think of that affect our project. Look at this. There are 13 inputs to identify risk. And what does that say to you? Risk is pervasive. It can come from anywhere. So a real big deal with risks. And of course, the output finally down here is the actual risk register that has, if you really don't get the grasp of risk management, you'll have a couple of dozen maybe risks, but boy, you can have hundreds and hundreds of risks. And don't think that's just weird, man. That's out of control. No, you could have that. And of course, then you'd prioritize them, and you'd watch the hottest ones constantly, and the other ones, especially ones where it's really low, like low or very low class, you may want to take them off and put them on a watch list. They're there, but you're not going to pay any attention to them right now. You review that list less regularly than your regular project register or risk register. And we'll see risk watch list as we go through here. So we're going to talk here about our inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs for identify risks. And yeah, again, wow, 13 inputs, really something, and 7 tools and techniques that are recommended to help you identify those risks. And again, it all funnels into one output, which is the risk register. We're going to take a little break here. When we come back, we're going to look further at the data flow diagram and then all the inputs, outputs, and in detail. Okay, so here we have the data flow diagram for the 11.2 identify risk process. And over here on the left, there they are. There's your inputs. A lot of them. They all feed into identifying risks. Your risk management plan that we just did itself officially, of course, comes in there to help us guide us through this process. And the output is one output, again, risk register. The risk register is used internally in the risk management knowledge area to do other tasks, to do our qualitative, quantitative analysis to help us with our risk management plan or risk response plans and in controlling the risks. But also it goes externally out to a number of processes too. Let's look at these a little bit. The yellow things here, the yellow processes are management plans. Like here's our stakeholder management or schedule management plan, cost management, quality management, human resource management plan. Those all come in because those are prime candidates for risk. People is a risk. Quality, doing that right is a risk. Your cost, getting out of control is a risk. Your schedule, getting that out of whack for internal or external reasons is a risk. So those all come in addition to other particular processes. Like here's create your work breakdown structure. Did you do that right? Was it enough detail? Did your work breakdown structure a dictionary that says here's how you're going to do the work? Is it right? If you do it that way and you're wrong, that's risk. Some of those are riskier than others. So all this stuff comes in that's considered the primary sources of risk, and they come in so you can identify them. And the outputs, other than internally here, go out to other processes now so that they can see what risks may impact them. In particular, the time management, cost management, quality, and procurement management use those so they can see what risks are identified so that they can help be on the lookout for those things and work obviously interactively with the project team and the project manager when they see things that may be occurring in their environment or possibly could occur. So here's our inputs again. Again, the blue box are all those plans that we saw in the data flow: risk, cost, schedule, quality, and human resource. The scope baseline itself, now we haven't gone through scope management again, but again, all these processes are interactive and iterative, and in a real project, you would probably be considering developing your scope plan and your scope breakdown, or work breakdown structure and all that while we're doing this, but we don't have that luxury here. But we'll just assume that there is a scope baseline. And what is the scope baseline? We'll get this in detail in scope management, but the scope baseline, and by baseline it means it's fixed, it's approved, that is the baseline that you are managing against until it ever changes. And what's in there? The project scope statement, which is a very concise statement of all what you're trying to deliver, your work breakdown structure with all the components of your deliverables, and then the dictionary is of those deliverable components in the WBS. Those are the how am I going to actually do this item, how am I going to execute it, build it, this piece of it, what's the cost of this, who's going to do it, what resource, do I need 8,400 pounds of steel, whatever it is, and the time it takes to do it. That's your dictionary. So your scope baseline is always subject to risk. All those variables could be very risky, and some you want to manage better than others. Activity estimates come in. Now you have cost estimates. Again, we haven't done cost management yet, or we haven't done time management yet, but it should still make sense that cost and time are risky. You do your best guess when you do your project schedule, and the word guess, that's what estimate. Okay, so you make activity guesses. Although estimates adds an element of intelligence to it. So you estimate your cost and duration, you baseline it, and you move along. But yet there's risk in there because they are estimates, even though you locked it in, and they're estimates until a certain time, right? When do they become actuals? When you actually spend the money, when you actually take the time, whether it's that exact time or more or less, whether it costs that much, more or less. But at some point, you'll be done with that item. You know exactly what it cost, exactly how long it took. But at that point in the game, game over. No risk. You can't plan for risk. You've already done it. If you're late, if it costs more, too late. So you need to do this in advance. And by the way, this bracketed scope, baseline, and estimates of cost and duration, remember what that is? Yeah? Triple constraint. So we're managing risk primarily with your triple constraint stuff, among many other things. Your stakeholder registers and input, of course, it has your stakeholder tolerances and items like that you need to manage, and they're good sources of information about risk, too, as we talked. Project documents come in, the project charter, the actual project schedule is subject to risk. Now the project schedule, as we'll see, is different than your schedule baseline. And I'll just tell you here, and you remember it later when we get into time management, but your project schedule is, for example, in the most simplistic form, that's your Microsoft Project Gantt chart. Okay, your project schedule, broken down by your WBS. And it is a living thing. You put in actuals, you schedule work, you do all this, but at some point in time, you're going to say, stop, this schedule is now the baseline. We're going to manage to this schedule right here now today. And you manage to it. Of course, now day two comes along and you're going to change your project schedule because now you know some actuals, you had some delays, whatever. So your project schedule now is morphing into something that is not the baseline. So as we'll see going on, your job as project manager and as a team is to bring that schedule back into the baseline. Okay, and if you're unable to do that for some reason, eventually you may have to re-baseline your project schedule, which is not a good thing if there's no real good cause or reason to do that. Like the client didn't say, okay, I'm changing the scope. That's a reasonable reason to change the baseline. But if you need to change the baseline because you just can't manage the project and say, oh, we're just out of control, that baseline now is just trash. We need to start over here. That's not a good thing. But anyway, that's the difference between a project schedule and a project, your schedule baseline, which we'll see when we get there. Project documents as inputs to identify risk, complexity, and level of detail of these documents impact risk. What this means is the quality that you put into producing any of your project documents, if they're sloppy, if they're too terse, if they don't give enough information that maybe only you in your mind know what you're talking about and nobody else can figure it out, that is risk. Because when a problem occurs, you're going to want to go to some of these documents and say, okay, what is it we're supposed to be? Well, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. So risk is also a factor in the completeness and accuracy, clarity of your documents. Environmental factors at play, you can bring in risk information from the environment, from outside in the real world. A classic example would be threats to a computer. your hackers. What's the current threat environment out there? You can have similar things with other products. You're trying to build certain things. There could be risk involved, but there may be elements outside, is the point, that you can draw upon to help you identify risks. Benchmarking, you could use it for that too. As you go along, here's a benchmark. Am I exceeding the benchmark or whatever? There are clues that risk is at play. And of course, risk attitudes out in the environment, either in your company or elsewhere, could have impact, as we talked about. Internally, your project files come in, risk templates if you have them, and of course you always want to look at lessons learned if they're available to see how others manage risk, how it impacted them, and what did they do about it. So a lot of inputs, 13 inputs, all this stuff comes in to help you now identify risks. And how now are we going to do that? We wash it through tools and techniques, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. All right, now we're going to talk about the tools and techniques available to us to identify risks given all those 13 inputs that we saw. Documentation reviews, quality of plans, like we talked about for your project documents, the quality of the plans you make, whether they're comprehensive, sloppy, terse. The plans are there for a reason. All your knowledge area plans, management plans, they're there to help you manage the project. If they're incomplete, if they're sloppy, if you didn't even do them, that is a big element of risk. So you need to review these documents to determine whether there are risk elements in there that you need to document and manage. Information gathering techniques. Okay, other than sitting down and looking at documentation, you can bring documents, you can bring whatever into a meeting with your experts, your team, stakeholders, whatever's appropriate, and you can brainstorm risks. What are our risks in this context, whatever it might be, and get information that way, slice and dice and categorize and come up with a lot of risks and put them in your risk register. Delphi technique is an interesting way of identifying risks. Many people, in particular stakeholders, they're the little g god of their domain, whatever it is, and they don't want to be embarrassed. They don't want to be caught like, boy, these people may not know what I'm really talking about. So they may be reluctant to offer a risk if it's something that they could have perhaps avoided themselves. So the point with Delphi is it's a brainstorming session, but it's anonymous. You don't know who said what. They do sealed, you can do a list of things here. Maybe it's automated on a PC, so you don't know, who did it. But whatever it is, or maybe a checklist kind of thing, and you don't know who did it, and they wrap it up and give it to you, and then you just see them all, and you can compile them then just like a brainstorming session. But the point there is then you can consolidate and get all this stuff down to where everybody finally has a consensus, and everybody's happy. That's basically the Delphi technique. It shields people from being embarrassed or being reluctant to participate in an open forum, where this one's private basically, but you get the same results if you're skillful in it. Interviewing is what you would mostly do with your stakeholders. You just sit down and talk to them. Boy, what do you think the problem is here? We're going to have trouble here. What do you think? And all these risks just come out, and you log them, and then you put them in your risk register after you wash them through some of your meeting reviews and so on. Root cause analysis is a big one. The root cause, if you can identify a root cause and manage the root cause, either mitigate it so that it doesn't happen, or if it does happen, it's very slight, the impact, or eliminate it altogether, then no risk, right, if you eliminate it. But there may be many risks that happen of various types, and none of those would actually happen if the root cause hadn't happened. So you need to really try and identify the root cause, because that could actually bring if you get a list of 500 risks, and you're good enough to aggregate them down and say, okay, here's a root cause for this 20, and you do that 5 times, you're going to have a list of 80 or 100 instead of 500, because you know what the root causes are. So that's another technique that you have in identifying risk. Checklist analysis. Based on historical information, lessons learned, you're going to go research, you're going to do a checklist of here's what I found from other projects, risks. It's a bad substitute, weak substitute, for real risk identification, but this is all you do, or much of what you do, at least it's something. But that's a technique you could use, is looking at old projects, lessons learned, and so on. By the way, as we'll see later, here's another term that a PMP exam may want to test you on. Checklist, and checklists are different than check sheets. This is a checklist we're talking about under risk management. A check sheet is used in your quality management functions, so you need to not confuse those. Assumptions analysis, as we mentioned a little earlier, just because something is an assumption means that it is a risk. It is an unknown, or at least it's not clearly understood. You're making an assumption, so it's a risk. Will it happen? Won't it happen? So you need to do an analysis. You need to do it early, and all assumptions are risky just by their nature. They're inaccurate. or they wouldn't be an assumption. They're unstable, they can change, they're inconsistent. You're just making assumptions about things. There's really no consistency to these things, and they're incomplete. If you had complete information, perhaps it wouldn't be an assumption to begin with. So you need to analyze all the assumptions that are in your plans, that are in the charter. You have assumptions in the charter. We want this project, we want to do all this, here's our the proposed money and milestones, but we're assuming that this stuff will be available. We're assuming that the company will still want this in 3 months. All these assumptions. So you need to manage those because it's just a natural elements of risk in there. You may want to resort, and this is a good thing, these are very effective diagramming techniques to help you identify risk. Cause and effect diagrams, and again, this here is another PMBOK terms and so on that they could quiz you on. A cause and effect diagram is also called an Ishikawa diagram, also called a fishbone diagram, and we'll see some examples of those. But this is a technique where you can map out elements and components of whatever you're looking at and try and identify risks in those things, sort of like a mind map, whatever you might want to do. System and process flow charts, if you have those and they're pertain to your project. Maybe you have a system process flow chart on how you would build a complex piece of equipment during your executing process. You'd look at that. So here's a risk here, right here. So you want to log that so you can manage it. And when they're working on that, you want to make sure that risk doesn't materialize. Or conversely, maybe you want it to materialize. If you say, boy, this is an opportunity waiting to happen, let's make it happen. That kind of thing. And here's something called an influence diagram. It's also called causal influences. And this is right out of PMBOK. Here you have a risk condition. You have your project estimates. You have an activity because of the estimates. You have your deliverables, but you have risk going on as causal. This diagram doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense totally. So let's look at what this really means. Let's take a real world example. This is a causal effect influence diagram here. There's external forces, internal forces. A good example might be, let's say there's a natural disaster, an earthquake, if you were to live in that area. What's the cause? That's the cause. What's the, what does that influence? Well, all of a sudden no fuel available because it's disrupted some gas lines. All of a sudden there's no electricity because it knocked out some power lines. All of a sudden the water's contaminated because your main water line split. You get dirty water. Okay, well what does that mean further? What's the further downstream of those things? Well, over here, your house may be damaged somehow. You have no utilities because of all this over here. You have no Wi-Fi, for example. So you have no communications. That's what a causal influence diagram is. And you can do this with risk. And the risk here would be, if your project or the location of the deliverable that you are building is in a risk-prone area like an earthquake area, it is very, even though you say, well, we have little tremors, big deal, the big one in Southern California, that's not going to happen in this 2-month project or 5-month project. Well, you don't know that. You're making an assumption. So you need to plan for that regardless. You say, okay, the risk is we'll have an earthquake. The possibilities of the results are these things, and what are you going to do about them? So that's risk management. That's identifying risks, as big or as small as they may be. You need to plan for them, document them, and manage them. And that's just one tool to use, this causal effect diagram. Another thing is called a SWOT analysis. This is your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats primarily within your own organization because they have direct influence over you. So organizational or even project strengths and weaknesses of those, you can leverage opportunities from the strengths that you have either in your organization or in your project, and you need to protect against the threats that are weaknesses in your company or in your project. And it is a tool and it's a technique you can use to, again, help you identify risk and then either capitalize on them or help you avoid them. And if you look in your PMBOK, it'll give you a little more information on that. Of course, the ever-present, almost ever-present, expert judgment comes to bear when you're trying to identify your risks. Get those who've had experience that can help guide you so you don't waste a lot of time, so you can focus on really the task at hand, which is identifying the real hot risks, at least at the beginning, and then all risks over time. So finally, the result of all this, you're going to have this long list of risks. You're going to put it in a risk register, which is an official project document. So, first here, let's say, initially, the first time around you ever do this, you're going to have a set of initially identified risks. Obviously, you had nothing before, now you have an initial list. And you may have then also what's called potential risk. Well, maybe this is it, but we haven't vetted it through our meetings or through some of our analysis or whatever it is you need to do where you would say, yes, this is a viable risk, put it in the risk register. So the initial ones go in the risk register. Then you have a list of potential ones. You come back to them later and then wash them through the process. And wash them through the process means progressively elaborate them into ongoing identified risks and planned risk responses. Now again, this is the first time we're talking right now through the risk register. So you are going to have planned risk responses. We plan to have a risk response for this, but we don't actually have that risk response plan yet. We plan to do it, and when we do it, we will have what's called a risk response plan for that threat or opportunity. So we have our risk register, and it has between some number and some bigger number of risks on it. And initially it's going to say, you know, we know these, we're going to look at these later, we're going to work with these first, and we're going to put our qualitative and quantitative analysis on them so we know just what it is we need to do if they happen, and then do some risk response plans. So we're going to look at that in our next module, which is qualitative and quantitative project risk analysis.